I nearly paid it without ever noticing. That's the part that still bothers me most, looking back on the whole thing. My property tax bill arrived in early October, same as it does every year, and I'd already written the check before something at the very bottom of the second page caught my eye. A small line item labeled Special Assessment Lien. HOA? For an amount I had absolutely no memory of ever approving or even hearing about at any community meeting I'd attended. My name is Foster Callendine. I'm 54 years old, and I've spent the last 26 years working as a forensic accountant, the kind of work where people bring me financial records specifically because something doesn't add up, and they need someone trained to find exactly where the discrepancy is hiding. I've traced embezzlement schemes for law firms, reconstructed falsified ledgers for insurance disputes, and testified in more courtrooms than I can easily count. None of that training prepared me for finding my own name attached to a hidden financial mess, sitting quietly in my own neighborhood's homeowners association. I live in a community called Brackenfield Commons, a modest, well-kept subdivision I've called home for 9 years. And I want to be honest that until that October morning, I'd never given the association's finances a second thought beyond paying my regular dues on time and occasionally skimming the annual budget summary that arrived in the mail each spring. That morning changed all of that permanently. I called the county tax assessor's office first, since the lien had appeared directly on my property tax bill rather than through any HOA correspondence I could recall receiving. A patient clerk named Wilhelmina Rourke pulled up the record for me over the phone and confirmed that a special assessment lien, filed by the Brackenfield Commons Homeowners Association roughly 4 months earlier, had been attached to my property specifically, along with, as it turned out, 17 other properties throughout the subdivision. The lien references an association resolution authorizing emergency infrastructure repairs, Wilhelmina told me. Beyond that, I can only tell you what's in our filing. You need to go through the association itself for the actual resolution details and the underlying invoices. I want to explain something about how homeowners association finances typically work, because it matters to understanding why this discovery felt so immediately wrong to someone with my particular professional background. Special assessments, when properly handled, follow a fairly standard process. The board identifies a genuine, documented need beyond what the regular annual dues can cover, holds a vote either at the board level or with broader membership depending on the amount and the association's bylaws, and then bills homeowners their proportional share, with the underlying invoices and contractor agreements available for any member to review upon request. I had never received notice of any board vote regarding emergency infrastructure repairs, never seen any community announcement about damage requiring emergency funding, and never once heard, in 9 years of occasional small talk at the mailbox cluster, so much as a rumor about anything in Brackenfield Commons requiring urgent, expensive repair. I called the HOA office directly, and after several days of being redirected between an answering service and a property management contact, who seemed genuinely unable to locate the underlying documentation I was asking about, I finally reached the association president herself, a woman named Bettina Aldercroft, who had held the position for just over 3 years. "Mr. Callendine," she said, once I'd explained why I was calling, "I can absolutely understand your concern, but I want to assure you this assessment was properly authorized. Our drainage infrastructure along the eastern retention pond required emergency remediation work last spring, and the board determined a special assessment was the most equitable way to fund it without depleting our general reserves. I'd like to see the board resolution authorizing that assessment," I said, "along with the contractor invoices for the remediation work itself." There was a pause on her end, brief but noticeable, the kind of pause I've learned over 26 years, usually means someone is deciding how much of the truth they're comfortable sharing in that particular moment. "I'll have our records committee compile that documentation and send it over," she said. That documentation, as it turned out, took considerably longer to arrive than any reasonable records request should have required. While I waited, I did what any forensic accountant with a functioning sense of professional curiosity would do. I drove out to the eastern retention pond myself, the one Bettina claimed had required emergency remediation, and spent a good 20 minutes walking its perimeter. I want to be clear that I found nothing whatsoever suggesting any recent repair work had occurred there at all. No fresh grading, no new drainage piping, no disturbed vegetation indicating heavy equipment had been through recently. Nothing beyond the same quiet, unremarkable retention pond that had sat there, functioning perfectly normally as far as I could tell, for the entire 9 years I'd lived in the neighborhood. I called a former colleague of mine, a civil engineer named Prudence Accoy, who occasionally consulted on drainage and infrastructure matters, and asked her to review some photographs I'd taken of the pond and its surrounding grading. She confirmed what my own untrained eye had already suspected. Nothing here shows evidence of recent remediation work, she told me. If anything, this looks like a pond that's been properly maintained on a normal schedule for years, not one that underwent any kind of emergency repair within the last 12 months. That was the moment the situation shifted, in my own professional understanding, from a possible administrative oversight into something considerably more deliberate. I called an attorney the following week, a sharp, methodical man named Cornelius Whitby, who'd handled homeowners association disputes throughout the county for close to 2 decades. I laid out everything for him: the mysterious lien, Bettina's vague explanation, and Prudence's professional assessment that the retention pond showed no signs whatsoever of the emergency work supposedly justifying the assessment in the first place. This is exactly the kind of situation where a formal records demand becomes necessary, Cornelius told me. Under state association law, you're entitled to review the board resolution, the vote record, and the underlying financial documentation for any special assessment levied against your property. If the association can't produce those records within the statutory timeframe, that failure itself becomes meaningful evidence. Cornelius filed the formal demand on my behalf, and this time, the association's response arrived considerably faster, though not in the form either of us expected. Rather than the requested board resolution and contractor invoices, Bettina's office produced a single-page summary claiming the remediation work had been performed by a contractor called Meridian Property Solutions, along with a total invoice amount that matched, almost to the dollar, the combined total collected from all 17 assessed properties. I ran a business registration search on Meridian Property Solutions that same afternoon, the same kind of search I perform routinely in my professional work, whenever a shell entity shows up somewhere it shouldn't. What I found stopped me cold. Meridian Property Solutions had been registered as a limited liability company just 8 months earlier, roughly a month before the special assessment appeared on my tax bill, and its registered agent address traced directly back to a residential property belonging to Bettina Aldercroft's own brother. I want to describe exactly what I did next, because it's the kind of methodical, unglamorous work that actually cracks these situations open, considerably more effective than any dramatic confrontation would have been at that stage. I requested, through Cornelius, a full accounting of every disbursement the association had made to Meridian Property Solutions, along with bank records showing where those funds had actually gone once they left the association's operating account. That request produced, after another round of delay and a second formal demand citing the statutory penalties for continued noncompliance, a partial set of bank statements that Bettina's office reluctantly provided. Reviewing them with the same careful attention I'd apply to any client engagement, I found that the association's operating account had transferred the full assessment amount, just over $81,000 collected from those 17 properties, into a business checking account held by Meridian Property Solutions at a bank roughly 30 miles outside our county entirely, an unusual choice for a local homeowners association vendor relationship, and precisely the kind of geographic distance fraud investigators like myself learn to view with immediate suspicion. From there, working with Cornelius and a private investigator he regularly retained for exactly this kind of financial tracing, we obtained records showing that the Meridian account had, over the following months, transferred the majority of those funds into a personal account held jointly by Bettina Aldercroft and her husband, with the remaining balance withdrawn in a series of cash transactions structured, deliberately or not, in amounts just below the threshold that typically triggers additional bank reporting requirements. I want to pause here and explain something about how a scheme like this typically survives as long as it does within a homeowners association, because understanding that mechanism mattered a great deal to how Cornelius and I eventually presented everything to the rest of the Brackenfield Commons membership. Most homeowners, myself included until that October morning, simply trust that their association's finances are being handled honestly, precisely because reviewing detailed financial records isn't something most people have the training, the time, or frankly, the inclination to do on a regular basis. A special assessment described in vague but official-sounding language, referencing emergency infrastructure work most residents have no direct way of verifying themselves, tends to get paid without much scrutiny, exactly the way I nearly paid mine without a second glance. What made this particular scheme especially effective, at least for the 8 months it operated before I happened to notice that line item, was the plausible-sounding infrastructure justification paired with a seemingly legitimate contractor relationship, one that would have looked, to any casual observer glancing at the association's books, like a perfectly ordinary vendor payment rather than what it actually was, a shell company created specifically to funnel homeowner assessment money into Bettina Aldercroft's own personal accounts. I learned, once Cornelius's investigator dug further, that Bettina had apparently used a similar structure once before, roughly 2 years earlier, involving a considerably smaller landscaping contract that had also traced back to a business entity connected to a family member. Though the amounts involved that time had been modest enough that nobody had ever thought to question it closely. The Brackenfield Commons Board called an emergency membership meeting once Cornelius formally presented our findings to them directly, rather than allowing the situation to play out purely through informal neighborhood gossip the way similar disputes sometimes do. I attended alongside Cornelius, and the community clubhouse, which I understood typically hosted these meetings with a fairly sparse turnout, was completely full that evening, word having spread quickly once residents realized their own special assessment payments were at the center of the discussion. Bettina opened the meeting attempting to characterize the entire situation as a misunderstanding regarding vendor documentation, insisting that Meridian Property Solutions had performed legitimate work, and that any delay in producing records simply reflected administrative disorganization rather than anything more serious. Cornelius responded by presenting, methodically and without embellishment, the timeline we'd assembled. The retention pond showing no evidence of remediation work. The business registration for Meridian tracing to Bettina's own brother's address, filed just weeks before the assessment appeared. The bank transfers moving assessment funds first into Meridian's account and then into Bettina's own personal accounts. And finally, the structured cash withdrawals that Cornelius noted, carefully, were exactly the kind of pattern that typically draws attention from federal banking regulators once formally reported. A board member named Terrence Whitlock, whom I'd met only briefly at prior community events, and who had, by his own account, always found Bettina to be an engaged and effective association leader, asked the question that seemed to finally settle the room's understanding beyond any further doubt. "Bettina," he said, "can you explain why an $81,000 assessment for pond remediation ended up in your own personal bank account rather than paid to an actual construction contractor?" Bettina's response, when it finally came, offered no real explanation at all, only a vague reference to administrative complexity and a promise to provide fuller documentation at a later date. An answer that satisfied absolutely nobody in that packed clubhouse. The board voted that same night to remove Bettina from her position immediately, and to formally refer the entire matter to both the County District Attorney's Office and state banking regulators. Given the clear evidence of fraudulent fund diversion and the structured cash withdrawals Cornelius had specifically flagged as a potential federal reporting violation separate from the underlying homeowner fraud itself, Terrence Whitlock stepped in as interim president and, working alongside Cornelius's office, commissioned a full independent audit of every association expenditure over the previous 3 years. An audit that, once completed several months later, confirmed the earlier landscaping contract discrepancy as well, though the total amount involved there remained considerably smaller than the retention pond scheme. I want to note that the 17 homeowners affected by that fraudulent special assessment, myself included, were fully reimbursed once the association's insurance carrier, and eventually a court judgment against Bettina personally made those funds available, though the process took the better part of a year to fully resolve, considerably longer than the initial theft itself had taken to execute. My property tax bill arrives every October now, the same as it always has, and I'll admit I scrutinize every single line item on it a good deal more carefully than I ever did before that particular morning. A habit I suspect will stick with me permanently regardless of how thoroughly Brackenfield Commons has since reformed its financial oversight procedures. The association now requires 2 independent board signatures for any expenditure over a modest threshold, along with mandatory competitive bidding documentation for any contractor relationship exceeding that same amount. Safeguards that should have existed from the very beginning, but somehow never had. Precisely the kind of gap that people in my profession see far too often in organizations that operate for years on nothing more than assumed trust. I think about that morning at my kitchen table often, the check already written, the pen already back in its holder, when one small line item at the bottom of a document I'd nearly signed off on without a second glance caught my eye purely by chance rather than any particular vigilance on my part. 26 years of forensic accounting work has taught me that the difference between a scheme that succeeds for years and one that gets caught in 8 months usually comes down to nothing more dramatic than somebody, somewhere, actually taking the time to read the fine print, rather than simply trusting that the numbers already add up the way they're supposed to. If this story hit home for you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep growing. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because there are plenty more stories just like this one still to come. Drop a comment down below and let me know what you thought of this one, or whether you've ever caught something buried in your own paperwork that turned out to be a lot more serious than it first appeared. I read every single comment, and honestly, some of the best stories on this channel started as a comment somebody left on a video just like this.